This Shabbat marks a momentous occasion in Jewish history. And perhaps you already know what I'm talking about if your Facebook feed looks anything like mine today. 100 years ago today, on March 18th, 1922, Judith Kaplan became the first American girl to have a bat mitzvah ceremony, held at the Society for the Advancement of Judaism, now known as SAJ, in New York. This synagogue had been founded only weeks earlier by Judith's father, Rabbi Mordechai Kaplan, after his increasingly bold and controversial ideas could no longer find a home in established Jewish communities. Kaplan would also go on to found the Reconstructionist movement. So just a little warning, in a few moments, I'd like to ask those of you here tonight who maybe had a bat mitzvah when you were 12 or 13, to go out on a limb and share your story with us. I'll let you know when it's time, but start thinking about what you might want to say. Rhea, you're tomorrow. You'll get to share like next year. In 1922, just a couple of years after women won the right to vote in America, it was Judith who began asking her father questions about the Jewish world around her. Why do men and women sit separately? Why don't women read the Torah? Kaplan's response to his daughter surprised her. He said, 2 years ago, women won the right to vote in this country. Now more women are working in stores, offices, and hospitals. They are learning to drive, too. But not much has changed in the synagogue, and that's not right. And so, to celebrate Judith as she turned 12, and became a bat mitzvah, he decided that she would also publicly celebrate this coming-of-age moment by reading Torah, or really from the Chumash, the book that contains the text of the Torah, in their synagogue on Shabbat morning. According to Judith Kaplan's account, her father, despite having thought about this idea of girls having banot mitzvah, only told her she'd be chanting in the synagogue the night before her bat mitzvah. So, Rhea, we let you prepare for a little while for tomorrow, yeah. In fact, Kaplan had already proposed the idea of bat mitzvah for all the girls at SAJ as they became 12 and received approval from his board of directors. But he wanted Judith, his eldest daughter, to be the first. In Jewish tradition, the sages designated 13 as the age of maturity for males and 12 as the age of maturity for females. In this gender binary system, there was less emphasis on a public ceremony and was instead about a change in status and legal obligations within the Jewish community. As a bar mitzvah, a son of the commandments, or bat mitzvah, a daughter of the commandments, a 13-year-old boy or a 12-year-old girl were seen by the rabbis of the Mishnah and Talmud, so dating back to around the 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era, as now being independently responsible for following the mitzvot, the sacred obligations or commandments of Jewish tradition. This change in legal status happens automatically when one wakes up on their 12th or 13th birthday, regardless of whether or not they hold a ceremony to mark this coming-of-age moment. While there may have been some celebrations of a moment to mark a girl's becoming bat mitzvah, perhaps with something like a festive meal and maybe even including the young girl giving some sort of talk or teaching, before Judith Kaplan, these celebrations did not make their way into the sanctuaries of synagogues. Even in the Reform movement, with its early emphasis on egalitarian values and shared roles of men and women, there really was no practice of celebrating girls with a bat mitzvah. Instead, in a push to create a more egalitarian practice, the Reform movement introduced the confirmation ceremony, in which slightly older young men and women could participate, and tried to actually de-emphasize the bar mitzvah, as there was no real consideration for the idea of a bat mitzvah ceremony for girls. Even after Judith Kaplan's bat mitzvah, 100 years ago, it took a long time for the rest of the Jewish world to consider making banot mitzvah regular occurrences in the synagogue. It's believed that the Reform movement didn't begin holding bat mitzvah ceremonies for girls until somewhere around the middle of the 20th century, if not maybe even a little bit later than that. In reflecting on the experience of her bat mitzvah later in life, Judith Kaplan Eisenstein wrote, "It would be less than the whole truth to say that I was as full of enthusiasm about the subject of the ceremony as my father was. I was worried about the attitude of my own peers, the early teenagers who even then could be remarkably cruel and disapprove of the exception, the person who does not conform to the normal practice. On the Shabbat morning of my bat mitzvah, we all went together, father, mother, disapproving grandmothers, my 3 little sisters and I, to the brownstone building on 86th Street in New York City, where the Society for the Advancement of Judaism carried out all its functions. Women's rights or no women's rights, the old habit of separating the sexes at worship died hard. The first part of my own ordeal was to sit in that front room among the men, away from the cozy protection of mother and sisters. When we finished the Haftarah, the reading from the prophets, I was signaled to step forward to a place below the bima at a very respectable distance from the scroll of the Torah, which had already been rolled up and garbed in its mantle. I pronounced the first blessing, and from my own Chumash, the 5 books of Moses, read the selection that my father had chosen for me, continued with the reading of the English translation, and concluded with the closing blessing. That was it. The scroll was returned to the ark with song and procession, and the service resumed. No thunder sounded, and no lightning struck. The institution of bat mitzvah had been born without incident, and the rest of the day was all rejoicing." So that's Judy's story. And now I'd like to invite some of you to share your stories of becoming a bat mitzvah. Now, I recognize that many women of a certain age in our community weren't given the opportunity to celebrate in this way at 12 or 13. But for those of you who were able to do so, I'd love to hear a memory of that experience that you'd be willing to share with us tonight. All right. We have our first. Hold on a second. I've got to. Can you hear me now? Okay, here. But I have one. Yeah.
I'm Bonnie Slavitt, and I joined this congregation 2 years ago. I'm a Jewish educator in the South Bay, and I have my little story. Why? Because a week from tomorrow, Congregation Beth David is celebrating all the Benot Mitzvah of the women in our congregation, and I'm putting that program together. So I'm Bonnie Slavitt, and on March 22nd, 1959, 2 months before my 13th birthday, I became a bat mitzvah. Like many of us who were baby boomers, every Friday night, 2 of us shared the bima at Temple Israel Center, a large conservative synagogue in White Plains, New York. I was given a booklet and a 78 red record, and I was told to learn half of that on the record called a Haftarah. Unfortunately, the statement of how poor my Jewish education was, I had no idea what I was memorizing. I thought the Haftarah was a half Torah, and I would sing the prayers and recite half of a half Torah. As my dad was a CPA, if somebody had said to me I was reciting the prophets, I would have responded, well, who's going to talk about the losses? The party with lots of gifts the next night took place in my parents' finished basement, just as it had done for my older sister 3 years before. It wasn't until I became involved at Hillel at the University of Wisconsin, and as I was sharing my bat mitzvah story, that it became clear to me that my Jewish education was terrible. I promised myself at that point that I would change that, and which led to a decision to take classes, go to the University of Judaism, become a Jewish educator. I couldn't have chosen a more rewarding or fulfilling profession, all because I thought that a Haftarah was a half Torah.
Thanks so much, Bonnie. Anybody else? Oh, great.
I have a story. I didn't get bat mitzvah as a young teenager. All the males in the family and friends who were male had their bar mitzvahs. But we decided that once I married, I had 4 children, and they were getting their Jewish education, and they were getting bar and bat mitzvah. I decided I was missing out. How can I encourage them to follow everything that we have done for so many years, but not be part of it myself? So I joined a group at our synagogue at age 60. And I studied for a couple of years. I learned how to read Hebrew better than I had before. And I became a bat mitzvah, surrounded by my children and grandchildren. It was a wonderful, wonderful feeling.
Just by a quick show of hands, how many here who maybe weren't able to have a bat mitzvah at 12 or 13 did it later in life? How many of you had an adult bat mitzvah? Raise them high, raise them high. Be proud, yeah. That's wonderful. Just so you know, if you haven't yet, you talk to me. There's time. Where'd the cantor go? Cantor Spall, you had a bat mitzvah.
Yeah, I had a bat mitzvah for sure. In 1982, by that time, girls were having bat mitzvahs, and a lot. And in fact, it was, I'm from the Valley in Los Angeles. Some of us are from our Valley girls. And it seemed like every single person that I knew was Jewish. They either went to, Adat Ariel or Temple Beth Hillel or VBS or, Isaiah or whatever. Anyway, there are a lot of temples in LA, and everybody was having them, and so did I. All of my family came in from New York, and it was really, really exciting. The one thing, and I was a conservative synagogue, and some of you know that the service sort of starts at 9 o'clock with the davening of the early morning prayers, which is only like my family sitting there and some of the regulars.
The dedicated regulars.
A very small group of regulars. And of course, and then I was leading it because I was a cantor already. And my path was already being laid. So I was up there leading what was called the shacharit, the early morning prayers, doing my thing. And then I told Rabbi this story. Then I saw this really cute kid who I invited to my bat mitzvah, not Jewish. Chris Stewart was his name, walking in, trying to balance his yarmulke on his head as he walked in across the back of the sanctuary. And he was, and his yarmulke, he was trying to keep on because his hair was long and feathered, in the early 80s. And I was mortified because nobody had told Chris Stewart that the service may start at 9 o'clock in the invitation, but you shouldn't get there until 10 when everybody else comes. And so I had a moment of feeling my heart in my throat as I saw him. I was up there singing Shochinah. It was a wonderful experience, though. We really for my family and all the pictures. I'm going to send in my picture for my bat mitzvah. I'm going to post it. Anyway, it was wonderful.
Anybody else want to share one or two more stories? Okay, that's okay. Tell me after the service, or share with each other. That's fine. Thank you to those of you who did. Really, much appreciated. I have to say today it's an honor to be able to share the bima with all of our b'nai mitzvah, whether a bar mitzvah, a bat mitzvah, or b mitzvah, or b'nai mitzvah for non-binary and gender fluid students who represent a broad diversity of interests and identities and genders expressions as they each take their place as teachers of Torah in our community. And each and every time, they rise to the occasion and offer a profound reminder of the importance of this beautiful tradition, this beautiful Jewish tradition, that we are each tasked to carry and pass on to the next generation. As the cantor often explains at our B'nai Mitzvah, each of these students is loved and appreciated for all of the wonderful uniqueness that they represent, and valued as the newest link in a long chain of tradition that stretches way back into our past and extends way out into our future, past Lador Vador, from one generation to the next. On this day in particular, we also honor the vision and bravery of one girl who paved the way for future generations of women to continue to imagine and expand what was and is and will be possible in the leadership of the Jewish people. Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. All right, Zimriah, come on up. If you're still here and you're in the Zimriah, come on up for